Hello everyone and welcome to Wormwood Tales. Relax and enjoy the story for sleep video. Before you drift off, I thought it would be a fun idea if everyone can leave a comment to let me know where you are listening from in the world. Let's begin. Before you settle into your bed tonight, I want you to do something simple but powerful. Turn off your lights, and let the room fall into complete darkness. Take a moment to feel the quiet around you. Now, as you lie back, open your eyes and look into the black screen in front of you. Let it become a doorway into the unknown. In the stillness, you'll find a world waiting for you. A world where light is a distant memory and darkness holds the answers. Take a deep breath and let go of everything around you. You're about to step into a place where the only thing that matters is what you can't see. Look into the black screen. Let it consume you. Let it follow you into sleep, and remember, it's not just a screen. It's a doorway. Alright, let's begin. The Lalaurie mansion, nestled in the heart of New Orleans, has always been a place of whispered legends and chilling rumors. Long before the fire that would reveal the horrific secrets within, the mansion was a subject of fascination for the locals, many of whom would cross the street just to avoid walking too close to its imposing iron gates. In a city steeped in ghost stories and eerie folklore, the Lalaurie mansion stood out as the most notorious of them all. The mansion was the home of Madame Delphine Lalaurie, a woman whose beauty and grace in the social scene of New Orleans aristocracy stood in stark contrast to the darkness that lived behind her doors. In the early 1800s, Delphine was known for her lavish balls, her impressive collection of slaves, and her impeccable taste. But there was something sinister beneath the surface, something that even her closest friends refused to acknowledge until the night of the fire in 1834. That was the night the walls of the Lalaurie mansion screamed with the truth, when a fire broke out in the kitchen and the horrific discovery of shackled, tortured slaves came to light. The city was shocked, but the worst part was that Lalaurie was nowhere to be found. She had fled in the chaos, disappearing into the shadows, and never returned. The mansion was left to rot, its reputation sealed forever in blood. But the stories didn't end with the fire. The mansion's ghostly reputation only grew, with rumors of haunting figures in the windows, strange noises in the night, and an unmistakable sense of dread that hung over it, even in the light of day. People whispered that the spirits of the tortured still lingered there, trapped between the realms of the living and the dead, waiting for their tormentor to return. Over the years, the Lalaurie mansion went through periods of neglect and restoration, but no matter who owned it or how much effort was made to restore its former glory, the mansion always carried with it a sense of foreboding. Those who lived near it swore they could feel the darkness in the air, the oppressive weight of something ancient and malevolent watching from behind its iron gates. They could hear cries faint at first echoing from the mansion's walls, as if the past was trying to claw its way back into the present. Yet, despite its terrifying reputation, the Lalaurie mansion remained a draw for those with a taste for the macabre. It became a tourist attraction, a place where people could tour the eerie halls and imagine what life must have been like in the early 19th century, before the fire revealed the truth. Ghost tours became a popular pastime for those looking for a thrill, each guide telling a slightly different version of the mansion's sordid history. But not everyone was content to merely view the mansion from the safety of a tour bus or behind the protective bars of a fence. Some, like Eleanor Blackwood, a historian and author of true crime, became obsessed with the Lalaurie mansion, determined to uncover the full extent of the horrors that had transpired within its walls. Eleanor had first heard of the Lalaurie mansion years ago, during a lecture on American history. The brief mention of Madame Lalaurie's gruesome actions had been enough to spark her interest, but it wasn't until she attended a New Orleans ghost tour, years later, that she truly became captivated by the mansion's dark past. The guide had told the usual version of the story: the fire, the escaped slaves, the sinister escape of Lalaurie, but it was the ghostly tales, the rumors of sightings and strange occurrences, that truly stirred something within her. Unlike others who might have found the tales of hauntings entertaining but nothing more, Eleanor's mind was driven by a need for answers. What happened in that house? Why had Lalaurie fled? What was the true story behind the fire, and what had she been hiding? Every time Eleanor returned to New Orleans for research, she found herself drawn back to the mansion, standing outside its gates, staring at its decaying beauty. The house seemed to call to her, pulling her in, and each time she visited, she learned something new about its haunted history, stories she had never heard before. Her obsession with the mansion grew stronger, and soon, it wasn't just the historical facts that called to her, it was the legends, the folklore, the whispers that ran through the city like an underground current. She began collecting old maps, ancient blueprints of the mansion, and documents from the period that spoke of the Lalaurie family's financial dealings, their social connections, and their supposed charitable works, each piece of evidence revealing another layer of the house's eerie charm. She spent sleepless nights poring over these documents, piecing together the puzzle of the mansion's history. Eleanor's book, The Haunting of Lalaurie Mansion, History or Curse, had become a modest success, but it only deepened her obsession. While others saw the mansion as an anomaly of history, something dreadful from the past best left forgotten, Eleanor believed there was something much more significant at play. Something beyond just the acts of cruelty that Lalaurie had committed, a power or force that had kept the mansion's evil alive through the centuries. It wasn't long before Eleanor decided to take the next step. Armed with her research, a camera, and a journal to document everything, she made the decision to spend a night inside the Lalaurie mansion itself. She would not only uncover the truth but also face the darkness head-on. Her determination had become an obsession, and she knew there was only one way to truly understand the full scope of what had happened within those walls. She would need to step into the very heart of the mansion where the horrors had unfolded. Eleanor's footsteps echoed in her mind as she imagined what it would be like to walk through those halls alone, with only the sound of her own breath to accompany her. But there was one question that lingered at the back of her mind, a question that she hadn't dared voice aloud: was she ready for the truth? And more chillingly, was the mansion ready for her? The Lalaurie mansion had been waiting for her, just as it had waited for so many before her. And now, it was ready to reveal its secrets. But as Eleanor stepped closer to the gates, she couldn't shake the feeling that the mansion wasn't just a relic of the past. It was alive in its own way, alive with something dark, something watching her, waiting. The legend of Lalaurie was far from over. It had only just begun. The Lalaurie mansion, perched on Royal Street in the heart of the French Quarter, is a haunting monument to a past drenched in blood and secrets. Its ornate, iron-wrought gates, its grand columns, and its sprawling, faded facade mask a history so vile that even the stones beneath its feet seem to whisper in fear. The mansion, a symbol of wealth and beauty in the 19th century, became infamous long before the fire that would expose the horrors within. But the rumors had already begun. Whispers carried through the cobbled streets of New Orleans, murmurs passed between terrified slaves and curious onlookers, all of them speaking of things too monstrous to imagine. The mansion was, in a way, a prison before it was ever set aflame. It was a place where dark secrets simmered, hidden beneath the polished surfaces and silk drapes. Some said that Madame Delphine Lalaurie, a woman of extraordinary wealth and social status, would entertain guests in her grand ballroom by day, while behind locked doors, she tortured her slaves, silent figures who were forced to endure the most unimaginable cruelties. They said that at night, strange sounds could be heard drifting from the house, agonizing screams, the sound of chains dragging across wooden floors, and the faintest, sickening scent of burning flesh. Yet, for years, these were only rumors. At least, until the fire. On a fateful April night in 1834, a blaze broke out in the mansion, a fire that would tear through the walls of the house and expose the true extent of its owner's depravity. When the firemen arrived, they found a grisly scene: the body of a woman who had been so terribly abused she could barely be identified, and a hidden attic filled with the mutilated bodies of enslaved men and women, starved, tortured, and left to die in unimaginable ways. Some were found with their limbs grotesquely twisted, others with their eyes sewn shut. The mansion, long since abandoned by its owner, was said to be haunted by the spirits of those who suffered there. The smoke of that night, it seemed, had never fully dissipated. Years passed, and the mansion was sold again and again, but the rumors continued. Stories of strange occurrences in the house, flickering lights, objects moving on their own, eerie cold spots circulated through New Orleans. Few dared to enter, and fewer still remained. The house had a reputation as one of the most haunted places in the city. And despite its crumbling grandeur, despite the fact that it stood as a relic of a horrific past, the mansion was still very much alive in the imagination of the city. Among those fascinated by its dark history was Evelyn Carr, a historian who had long been obsessed with the shadows of New Orleans. A writer by trade, she spent her days combing through dusty archives and old journals, piecing together the puzzle of the city's past. But no part of that history haunted her as much as the Lalaurie mansion. Evelyn had heard the rumors, of course everyone had. As a child, she had listened to her grandmother tell tales of the mansion's ghostly visitors, of the sounds that echoed through the quiet streets at night. But as she grew older, those stories began to lose their grip on her imagination. Or so she thought. It wasn't until one fateful evening, while sifting through a forgotten collection of 19th-century journals in an obscure library, that she stumbled upon something that would draw her back into the mansion's grip, an account written by a man who had lived through the fire. The words, scrawled in frantic handwriting, described the horror he had witnessed within the house, a chilling confession of what had truly happened inside those walls long before the fire exposed the truth. That was the moment Evelyn knew she had to go. She couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to the story than what was written in the history books. She had to see the house for herself. Her fascination with the Lalaurie mansion, once a distant curiosity, had become an obsession. She spent weeks researching every fragment of information she could find: letters, diaries, police reports, anything that could piece together the full story of Delphine Lalaurie's twisted legacy. But no matter how many facts she uncovered, no matter how much she learned about the mansion's history, it wasn't enough. There were gaps, unanswered questions, inconsistencies. And so, Evelyn made plans to travel to New Orleans. She would spend weeks in the city, walking its streets, breathing in its damp, fragrant air, and listening to the stories still told by its people. She needed to understand, to uncover the parts of the story that had been buried, silenced by the years. She was determined to get inside the mansion itself if it still stood. And if it did, she was determined to uncover whatever truths lay hidden in the decaying walls. But she hadn't expected what she would find. It was a crisp autumn evening when Evelyn first arrived in New Orleans, the city's historic charm pulling her in with its ancient allure. The Lalaurie mansion was still standing, though it looked like a hollow shell of its former self. No longer a home, it had been abandoned for decades. The iron gates, rusted and barely clinging to their frames, loomed ominously in front of her as she approached the property. The mansion's facade was crumbling, but there was no denying the power it held over her, the power it had held over everyone who dared to come near. As Evelyn walked through the gates and approached the mansion's front steps, a chill ran down her spine. She couldn't tell if it was the wind, the weight of the mansion's history, or something far darker that lingered in the air. Her footsteps echoed as she climbed the steps, her heart pounding louder with each one. The doors were locked, as expected, but Evelyn had come prepared. With a sense of determination, she found a small window in the back of the house, just large enough for her to slip through. Once inside, she stood in the entryway, her breath catching as she took in the decaying grandeur of the mansion. The floors were cracked, the walls scarred by time and neglect, but the air was thick with something else, something old, something that had not yet let go of this place. For a moment, Evelyn stood still, allowing the house to settle around her. But as the quiet deepened, a soft sound reached her ears, faint, but unmistakable. A whisper, almost like a breath, skimming the surface of the air. She froze, her heart skipping a beat. It was then that Evelyn realized, the rumors, the stories, everything she had read and heard, they were not just tales. The Lalaurie mansion held more than just the weight of its history. It held something far worse. And as she stepped further into the house, a deep, gnawing feeling settled in her gut. She had just crossed a line, and there was no turning back. The Lalaurie mansion stands in the heart of the French Quarter of New Orleans, a dark and imposing structure that looms over the cobbled streets like a forgotten relic. For nearly 2 centuries, its story has been whispered through the alleyways, carried on the humid, heavy air that blankets the city. It's a tale that defies time, a legacy of unspeakable horrors that still haunt the mansion's towering walls. The house, with its shuttered windows and iron balconies, has earned a reputation that far surpasses even the legends of the quarter itself. And though the mansion has changed owners, fallen into disrepair, and seen the passing of countless generations, its name has never been free from the shadows of its grim history. Long before the fire of 1834 revealed the house's darkest secrets to the world, rumors about the Lalaurie mansion had been circulating through the narrow streets of New Orleans. Some spoke of a beautiful woman, a rich, refined socialite who charmed the city with her elegant soirees and polished demeanor. But others whispered about her cruelty, hidden behind the smiles she wore at lavish parties, behind the sharp glint of her jewels, behind the laughter that echoed through the halls of her home. It was said that Madame Delphine Lalaurie had a temper unlike any other, and that her beauty only served to mask the depths of her malevolent soul. In the early 1800s, New Orleans was a place where the opulence of the wealthy coexisted with the suffering of the enslaved. Lalaurie's mansion was no exception. Built on Royal Street, it was an architectural marvel, a sprawling, 3-story home that radiated wealth and status. Yet beneath the grandeur, the mansion was a prison, a place of untold suffering that only the walls knew. Rumors of mistreated slaves circulated for years, but they were silenced by the powerful influence of Madame Lalaurie. It wasn't until the fire of 1834 set in the mansion's kitchen by an enslaved woman desperate to escape that the truth was finally revealed. The fire exposed what lay hidden behind the walls of the mansion, the tortured, mutilated bodies of men, women, and children who had been subjected to grotesque, unimaginable horrors. Chains, shackles, and cruel devices were found in secret rooms, while the survivors spoke of being experimented on, beaten, starved, and maimed in ways that were too vile to be believed. The entire city was shocked, horrified, but no one could have predicted what came next. Madame Lalaurie, in a frenzy of fear and guilt, vanished without a trace. She was never seen again. Though Lalaurie disappeared into the pages of history, her mansion remained. In the years that followed, rumors continued to swirl about the Lalaurie mansion. Some said the house was cursed, haunted by the souls of those who had suffered within its walls. Others claimed the mansion was alive, feeding on the fear of those who dared to approach. Over time, the building became a dark legend in the city, a symbol of the deep, unfathomable evil that had once dwelled within. People who stayed in the mansion or even ventured too close reported strange occurrences, whispers in the dead of night, the sound of chains dragging across the floor, and fleeting glimpses of shadowy figures in the windows. Some said they felt eyes upon them, a cold presence that lingered in every corner, waiting for something, or someone. But for all the rumors, the mansion stood silent, watching, waiting. Its secrets remained buried beneath layers of dust and time, its history a mixture of myth and reality. Until one day, someone came along who would not be content with the whispers of others. Enter Ethan Turner, a young historian with a passion for unraveling the mysteries of the past. His fascination with the Lalaurie mansion had begun as little more than an academic curiosity, a desire to explore the true story behind one of New Orleans' most infamous landmarks. But what started as a mere interest soon grew into an obsession. Turner had always been drawn to the darker side of history, the hidden corners where stories were buried, where the truth was often more terrifying than any fiction. His research into the Lalaurie mansion consumed him, day and night. He pored over old documents, newspaper clippings, and journals, piecing together the fractured history of the mansion. What he discovered only deepened his intrigue. In his research, Turner uncovered accounts from those who had lived in the area during the fire, personal diaries that spoke of strange happenings even before the truth about Madame Lalaurie was revealed. One account, in particular, stood out to him: a letter from a woman who had attended one of Lalaurie's infamous parties just days before the fire. The woman described feeling an overwhelming sense of dread upon entering the mansion, as though something was watching her from the shadows. She wrote about hearing strange noises, whispers that didn't belong, and a cold, almost oppressive atmosphere that hung heavy in the air. But what truly disturbed Turner were the rumors of Madame Lalaurie's own descent into madness. According to one account, she had begun to speak of the house as though it were a living thing, a presence that had claimed her as its own. The woman had even claimed to see Lalaurie standing alone in the mansion's grand parlor late at night, staring into the mirror with a look of absolute horror on her face. She saw something in that mirror, the woman had written, something that wasn't her own reflection. As Turner dug deeper, the pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place, but the more he uncovered, the more unsettled he became. There were patterns in the accounts, patterns that suggested the mansion's dark legacy wasn't merely the result of a cruel woman's actions, but something older, something far more sinister. The rumors of the mansion being alive began to take on a new meaning in his mind. It wasn't long before Turner found himself drawn to New Orleans, compelled to see the mansion for himself. His mind was made up: he would spend a week in the Lalaurie mansion, conducting his own investigation. But what began as a professional inquiry into history soon took on a far darker tone. There was something about the mansion, something unshakable, that seemed to call to him, beckoning him to unlock its final secret. As Turner stood before the mansion's wrought iron gates, he could feel it, the weight of the house's history pressing down on him, the suffocating sense of something watching from within. He took a deep breath and stepped forward, unaware that the moment he crossed the threshold, his life would never be the same again. The Lalaurie mansion had a way of consuming those who sought to uncover its secrets. And Turner, driven by an insatiable need to understand, was about to become another part of its dark history. The Lalaurie mansion loomed against the backdrop of a moonless sky, its jagged silhouette cutting through the fog like a knife. Tucked away on Royal Street in New Orleans, it had become more than just a historical landmark. It was a whispered legend, its name synonymous with unspeakable cruelty, ghostly apparitions, and an air of dread that seemed to cling to the very stones of the building. For decades, tourists had flocked to the mansion, drawn by its macabre history. They marveled at its elegant facade, oblivious to the horrors that had transpired behind the ornate iron gates. Some claimed to have heard strange whispers, others swore they'd seen shadows moving in the windows late at night, when the rest of the city slept. But few dared to enter its darkened halls, and fewer still dared to stay. Dr. Eleanor Graves was not one of those few. A historian with a passion for the macabre, Eleanor had spent years researching the mansion's notorious past. She had pored over every available document, every faded letter and tattered journal, but there was always one detail that eluded her. Despite her best efforts, there were no survivors of the mansion's gruesome past to tell the tale. The accounts of the fire in 1834, the discovery of the mutilated bodies hidden behind locked doors, were all horrifying, but they were just that, stories. Rumors. Gaps in the historical record that no one had ever fully explained. And so, Eleanor decided to do what no one else had dared. She would spend the night in the Lalaurie mansion, hoping to uncover the truth, to experience firsthand the history that had left the world so unsettled. Armed with her notebooks, a camera, and a determination that bordered on obsession, she arrived in New Orleans, ready to immerse herself in the eerie silence of the mansion. The city, with its vibrant nightlife and haunting melodies of jazz echoing through the streets, seemed oblivious to the dark secret hidden in the heart of its oldest quarter. Eleanor had arrived in the city alone, a single suitcase in hand, but she felt the weight of the mansion's reputation pressing on her chest, making every step toward it feel like an intrusion. Her taxi stopped in front of the wrought iron gates, and she stared up at the towering structure, the windows dark and lifeless. She had read about Madame Delphine Lalaurie, the elegant, aristocratic woman who had once lived in the mansion with her husband, Dr. Louis Lalaurie. She had heard the stories of the horrors that took place in the attic, stories of enslaved people subjected to unthinkable tortures, stories of the night the mansion was set ablaze, leading to the discovery of what was hidden behind its walls. The fire, which had started in the kitchen, was the catalyst that had brought the mansion's secrets to light. But even now, more than a century and a half later, the mansion's past haunted the streets, its dark history refusing to fade with time. Eleanor stepped out of the taxi, her heels clicking sharply against the cobblestone streets. The driver didn't wish her well as she left. He didn't need to. Everyone in New Orleans knew the truth: there was something wrong with that house. Something wrong with its history. But Eleanor didn't care for superstition. She was a woman of facts, of evidence, and she believed there were answers to be uncovered. The front door creaked open with an unsettling groan, as though it had been waiting for her. Inside, the mansion was as she had imagined: grand, decaying, and suffocating. The air was thick with the smell of mildew and something darker, something that clung to the very fabric of the place. The walls were adorned with peeling wallpaper, and the once grand staircase was covered in dust, its wood warped with age. She could feel the weight of the mansion's history pressing down on her, but she refused to let it deter her. As she moved through the dark hallways, her footsteps echoing loudly in the silence, she couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't truly alone. The house seemed to watch her, its creaks and groans like whispers from the past. She stopped in front of the grand staircase that led to the second floor, where, according to the old accounts, the true horrors of the mansion had been hidden. With a deep breath, Eleanor began her ascent. The further she went up, the colder the air became. It wasn't just the temperature, it was something else, something that seemed to seep into her bones. By the time she reached the top of the stairs, Eleanor was shaking, though she tried to convince herself it was just the chill of the old house. She wandered down the hallway, her flashlight flickering as she passed rooms that were dark and locked. The sound of her breathing seemed unnaturally loud, and as she approached the far end of the corridor, she felt a strange pull, an invisible tug drawing her toward a door that had long been sealed. The attic. The very thought of it sent a shiver down her spine. For years, historians had speculated about what lay behind that door. Some believed the secret to the mansion's curse was contained within that room. Others, more superstitious, claimed that the house itself would never let anyone uncover its true horrors. Eleanor knew that her journey, her investigation, would never be complete without understanding what had happened in that attic. Without finding the truth. With a deep breath, she placed her hand on the handle. The door swung open with an eerie creak, revealing nothing but darkness. But then, just as she stepped inside, the temperature plummeted, and she felt a presence, an unseen watcher hovering just behind her. Before she could turn, she heard a soft whisper. It was a voice, low, almost imperceptible, but unmistakable in its urgency. "Leave this place." Eleanor froze. The voice wasn't hers. It wasn't anyone she knew. It was coming from the walls. The Lalaurie mansion loomed on the edge of the French Quarter like a silent sentinel, its faded grandeur a stark contrast to the bustling streets of New Orleans. To the untrained eye, it appeared just another relic of the past, a decaying piece of history hidden in plain sight. But to those who knew its story, the mansion was more than just a historical landmark. It was a cursed monument to cruelty, horror, and secrets too terrible to be fully understood. As nightfall descended upon the city, the mansion seemed to grow darker, the air heavy with the weight of its history. The lanterns lining the streets flickered in the breeze, casting long shadows that danced eerily against the mansion's towering walls. In the dim light, the building's windows, dark and unyielding, stared out like hollow eyes, watching the living with a haunting gaze. For decades, Rumors had whispered through the streets of New Orleans, rumors of ghostly apparitions, unexplained disappearances, and the anguished cries of those who had suffered within its walls. But for most, the mansion was nothing more than a macabre curiosity. Tourists flocked to it, taking photographs and listening to the embellished tales of its dark history, only to leave with a fleeting sense of dread, unaware of the true terror that lingered within. But there was one person who refused to look away. Lena had always been fascinated by the Lalaurie mansion. A historian by trade, she had studied the mansion's tragic past for years, poring over old documents and faded photographs, piecing together the story of Madame Delphine Lalaurie and her unspeakable crimes. The stories had chilled her to the bone. The discoveries made after the fire of 1834, the horrific treatment of the enslaved people who had been trapped within the mansion's walls, and the legend of Lalaurie's escape. For years, Lena had read about the mansion from a safe distance. But now, driven by an insatiable need to uncover the truth, she had made the decision to visit New Orleans, to walk through the very rooms where the darkest chapters of history had been written. She wasn't there for the ghost stories or the sensationalized rumors. No, she was there for something deeper, something more elusive, the truth that had been buried beneath the mansion's cobbled floors and rotting walls. She would not be content until she understood what had happened in that place, what had truly driven Delphine Lalaurie to commit such atrocities. The moment Lena set foot on the mansion's grounds, she felt a chill in the air. It wasn't the typical dampness of a New Orleans evening, nor was it the cool breeze that blew in from the river. This was something far more unsettling. It was a feeling, an unseen presence, that seemed to watch her every move. She brushed it off as nerves, the weight of the history too heavy for her to ignore. After all, she had studied it all, the terrible accounts, the rumors of ghosts, the strange disappearances of those who dared to delve too deeply into the mansion's past. But she had never believed the supernatural was truly at play. Her footsteps echoed in the empty courtyard as she approached the front door, her hand hesitating before it touched the brass knocker. The door, heavy and imposing, seemed to stand as a barrier to the world beyond. As if sensing her approach, the mansion felt even more alive now, its ancient bones creaking and groaning in protest, as though the building itself was unwilling to let her in. "Hello," she called out softly, her voice betraying the slightest tremor. "Is anyone here?" There was no response, save for the rustle of wind through the trees. Lena swallowed, her heart racing. The silence was oppressive, and for the briefest moment, she wondered if she should turn back. But something kept her rooted to the spot, a nagging sensation that the answers she sought were just beyond the door, waiting for her to find them. The door creaked open on its own, revealing the dark, hollow interior. The air inside was stale, thick with the scent of dust and decay. She stepped over the threshold, feeling the weight of history press down upon her. Each step she took seemed to make the air grow heavier, as though the very building was resisting her presence. But she pressed on, determined to find what she had come for. As she ventured deeper into the mansion, Lena's footsteps seemed to be swallowed by the vast emptiness. The walls, adorned with faded tapestries and tarnished portraits, seemed to close in around her. Her mind raced, flashing between the gruesome accounts of the mansion's past and the strange sensations she felt as she moved through the darkened rooms. She passed by the staircase that led to the upper floors where, according to legend, the most horrific discoveries had been made. Her skin prickled as she glanced up toward the second floor. There was no one there, of course, but the way the shadows shifted in the dim light made her uneasy. The staircase creaked as though someone or something was walking above her. Lena stopped, her breath caught in her throat. She hadn't heard the sound before, had she? Was it simply the house settling? Or was it something more? Suddenly, a soft whisper echoed from the hallway behind her. It was faint, barely audible, but unmistakable. A voice low and unintelligible carried on the air. She froze, her body tense. "Who's there?" she called out, her voice louder now, demanding an answer. No response. The silence was suffocating. Her pulse quickened as she turned back, her eyes scanning the dark corners of the room. The whispering continued, growing louder now, just out of reach. She could feel it, a coldness, a presence that was not her own, creeping up behind her. Lena spun around, but no one was there. The hallway remained empty, the shadows creeping along the walls as if they were alive. Her heart began to race, her breath coming faster. Was it a ghost, the spirit of one of the victims who had suffered within these walls? Or was it simply her mind playing tricks on her? Before she could consider this further, the floorboards above her creaked again. The sound was unmistakable, a deliberate step, followed by another. Someone or something was up there. And it was waiting for her. The Lalaurie mansion stood as an ominous relic of a time long past, its once grand facade now faded and broken, hidden beneath layers of decay. Located on Royal Street in the heart of the French Quarter, it loomed above its surroundings like a silent, brooding sentinel, its dark windows staring out onto the bustling streets below as if watching the pulse of life with a malevolent gaze. Though centuries had passed since its most horrifying days, whispers of its gruesome past still echoed through the alleys of New Orleans, carried on the lips of tourists, residents, and those who dared to stand too close to its gates. Some people came to the mansion out of curiosity, their fascination with the dark stories of the place irresistible. Others, like Cassandra Miles, came for a purpose far more personal. Cassandra was a historian, a writer of the macabre, a collector of haunted tales, and, above all, a seeker of the truth that lay hidden beneath the layers of myth and superstition. When she first read about the Lalaurie mansion, it was not the story of Delphine Lalaurie's sadistic cruelty or the grisly discoveries made after the fire that caught her attention, but the mansion itself, the way it seemed to absorb the darkness of its past and hold it within its walls like a parasite feeding off the memories of the horrors it had witnessed. For weeks, she had researched the mansion's history, combing through old letters, diaries, and faded newspaper clippings. There were stories of the fire, of the tortured souls trapped inside, and the accusations of witchcraft that followed Lalaurie's disappearance. But there was something more, a strange, unexplainable element to the mansion that no one seemed to fully understand. It was as if the house itself had become a part of the legend, a sentient entity whose very structure absorbed the violence and terror it had once harbored. In the stories she uncovered, the mansion wasn't just a house, it was a character in its own right. Cassandra couldn't resist. She had to go. She had to stand in the place where so much suffering had been inflicted, to walk the halls where the cries of the lost souls were said to still echo at night. She told herself it was for research, but deep down, she knew she was drawn by something more primal, something that stirred within her a deep and inexplicable fear. The idea of entering the mansion alone seemed madness, yet the pull was undeniable. The promise of unlocking the mansion's secrets consumed her thoughts day and night, until finally, she booked a flight to New Orleans, telling no one but a few close colleagues. Arriving late at night, the city was already steeped in its usual mist, a dense fog hanging in the air that swallowed the streets and created an eerie, dreamlike atmosphere. The soft click of Cassandra's heels echoed through the damp streets as she made her way to the mansion. The closer she got, the more her heart began to race. It wasn't the darkness or the fog that unnerved her, it was something else. Something that made the air around the mansion feel heavier. She had been to plenty of historic places before, some with dark pasts, but this felt different. The temperature seemed to drop as she passed under the archway and approached the large iron gates that stood in front of the mansion, their black bars twisted and jagged like the remnants of something broken. The gates creaked open on their own, the sound almost like a whisper, as if the mansion itself was welcoming her inside. She hesitated for just a moment but then pressed forward, drawn by the magnetic pull of the place. As she stepped onto the property, she felt an unsettling chill wrap around her, like a cold hand brushing against her skin. The mansion loomed before her, towering against the night sky, its windows dark and empty. There was no sign of life, no lights in the windows, no movement inside. Yet, Cassandra couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. She stood there for a long time, staring at the facade, her mind racing with the knowledge of the horrors that had transpired there. Her fingers tightened around the strap of her bag as she glanced up at the second-story window, the one where, according to the legends, Madame Lalaurie had been seen watching from the shadows, her face twisted in rage. It was said that even after all these years, she still returned, her spirit trapped within the house, unable to escape her own cruelty. Cassandra shook her head, trying to push the thought away. She wasn't here for ghosts or curses. She was here to uncover the truth. But as she made her way toward the front door, her footfalls seemed to echo louder than they should have, unnaturally amplified in the silence of the night. The door before her, once grand and imposing, now appeared decrepit and weathered, its wood warped and cracked. As she reached out to grasp the tarnished handle, her breath caught in her throat. For a brief, fleeting moment, she thought she saw a shadow move behind one of the broken windows. She froze, her hand hovering in the air, and waited. Nothing. But when she stepped closer, she could have sworn she heard something faint, like a whisper, or perhaps a murmur coming from deep inside the house. Her heart began to pound. She knew she should turn around, walk away, and head back to the safety of her hotel. But the pull was stronger now. Stronger than her fear. Stronger than reason. She stepped forward, the door creaking open slowly as if giving way to some invisible force. Cassandra's eyes narrowed, her breath visible in the cold air. She stepped inside. And the door slammed shut behind her. In the heart of New Orleans, where the air is thick with history and the streets echo with the faint strains of jazz, one building stands apart, a mansion that casts a shadow far darker than the others. The Lalaurie mansion, with its tall, imposing walls and wrought iron balconies, looms on the corner of Royal Street like a specter. To passers-by, it appears lifeless, a relic of a time long gone. Yet, those who dare to linger often feel the weight of unseen eyes upon them, an oppressive energy that seems to seep from the very walls. For decades, the mansion has been shrouded in stories that are whispered in hushed tones. Tour guides often pause outside its gates during ghost tours, their voices softening as they recount its infamous past. The tale begins with Madame Delphine Lalaurie, a socialite whose beauty and charm belied the monstrous deeds that unfolded within the mansion's walls. The house has a way of drawing people in, and not just the curious tourists who pass by during the day. Paranormal investigators, thrill seekers, and even skeptics have all been lured to its threshold, each one leaving with their own chilling account or not leaving at all. One such story comes from Marcus, a local guide who has spent years telling the tales of New Orleans' haunted locations. Marcus often avoided the Lalaurie mansion. Some places, he would say, are better left alone. But one evening, after a night of guiding a particularly skeptical group, he found himself standing before the mansion. He wasn't there to challenge its ghosts or to disprove the legends. Something had compelled him, a feeling he couldn't quite explain. The mansion seemed different that night, almost alive. The lights from the surrounding street lamps flickered as if struggling to stay lit, casting the building in intermittent shadows. The air was heavier than usual, carrying a faint metallic scent that made Marcus's stomach turn. He took a step closer to the gate, his fingers brushing against the cold iron. A chill ran up his spine, and he froze. For a moment, he could swear he heard something, a faint whisper carried on the breeze. He turned, expecting to see one of the tourists lingering behind, but the street was empty. Marcus laughed nervously, shaking his head. "Just my imagination," he muttered. But as he turned back to the mansion, the whisper came again. This time, it was unmistakable. A voice, soft yet clear, called his name. "Marcus." He stumbled back, his breath quickening. The voice was coming from the mansion, from somewhere deep within its darkened windows. Marcus's rational mind tried to explain it away, a trick of the wind, maybe. But the voice called again, more insistent this time. "Marcus, come inside." His heart pounded as he took an involuntary step forward. His feet moved as if they had a mind of their own, drawing him closer to the door. The voice was hypnotic, wrapping around him like a vice, compelling him to obey. When he reached the front steps, the door creaked open, though no one was there to greet him. The darkness inside seemed to breathe, inviting him into its depths. Against his better judgment, Marcus stepped through the threshold. The door slammed shut behind him with a force that echoed through the empty halls. Marcus spun around, trying the handle, but it wouldn't budge. He was trapped. The air inside was colder, heavy with the scent of decay and something else, something sweeter, like burnt sugar. He called out, his voice trembling. "Hello. Is someone here?" The mansion responded with silence, but the oppressive feeling of being watched grew stronger. He took a cautious step forward, the floorboards creaking beneath his weight. His flashlight, weak and flickering, illuminated the grand yet decaying interior. The walls were lined with cracked plaster, and the faint outline of what had once been elaborate wallpaper was barely visible. Then, he saw it, a shadow darting across the far end of the hallway. It was quick, almost too quick to register, but it was enough to send a jolt of fear through him. He raised his flashlight, but the beam revealed nothing. "Hello," he called again, his voice echoing. A faint laugh echoed in response, chilling and childlike. It came from above him. Marcus looked up, his flashlight trembling in his hand. On the second-floor balcony, a figure stood, small, almost childlike, with long, dark hair that hung over its face. It tilted its head, as if curious, before disappearing into the shadows. Marcus's instincts screamed at him to leave, but the door remained locked, and his feet felt rooted to the spot. The faint sound of footsteps echoed from the second floor, descending the staircase toward him. They were slow and deliberate, each step reverberating through the house. The whispers returned, now overlapping, surrounding him. They were faint at first, but they grew louder, more urgent. "Marcus, stay. Marcus, leave. Marcus." The conflicting commands twisted his mind. His breathing grew shallow, and his vision blurred. The footsteps stopped just as they reached the bottom of the stairs. Marcus's flashlight flickered, casting sporadic light on the staircase, but there was nothing there. Or so he thought. A single word shattered the silence, spoken in a voice that was not quite human. "Run." Before Marcus could react, the whispers erupted into a deafening roar, and the darkness swallowed him whole. When the door to the Lalaurie mansion was found ajar the next morning, there was no sign of Marcus. His tour group reported him missing, but the police search turned up nothing except his flashlight, lying in the center of the grand hallway, its beam pointing toward the staircase. The mansion stood silent once more, its secrets buried within. But those who passed by claimed they could hear faint whispers, a name carried on the wind. Marcus. Marcus. The Lalaurie mansion had claimed another. In the heart of New Orleans, where the streets hum with the faint echoes of jazz and the air is thick with the scent of magnolia and rain, there lies a house unlike any other. Its grand facade, once the envy of the wealthy elite, now stands as a dark sentinel over Royal Street. To the casual observer, it might appear as just another historic building, a relic of a bygone era when elegance and opulence defined the French Quarter. But those who know its history would never dismiss it so lightly. The Lalaurie mansion isn't just a house. It's a wound carved into the soul of New Orleans, a place where beauty masked unimaginable horror. Over the years, countless stories have been whispered about the mansion. Guides tell their wide-eyed audiences tales of ghostly apparitions, disembodied screams, and doors that slam shut of their own accord. It's said that no one who enters the house at night leaves unchanged, and many refuse to speak of what they've experienced. but the allure of the mansion is undeniable. Tourists and locals alike are drawn to it, as though its sinister past has woven itself into the very fabric of the city. On any given night, you might see them gathered outside its iron gates, their faces illuminated by the soft glow of street lamps, waiting for the next story to be told. Some come seeking a thrill, others out of morbid curiosity. A few, though, come looking for answers. One such person was Clara Duval. A historian with a fascination for the macabre, Clara had spent years researching the darker side of history. She'd heard the stories of the Lalaurie mansion during her first trip to New Orleans as a teenager, and they had never left her. There was something about the juxtaposition of wealth and depravity, of grandeur and suffering, that had taken root in her mind. She'd made it her life's work to uncover the truth behind the legends that haunted places like this. And now, 20 years later, she was finally standing before the infamous house. It was dusk, the city bathed in a golden light that made the mansion's pale walls glow with an almost ethereal beauty. But even in this soft light, there was something unsettling about the house. The windows, tall and dark, seemed to watch her like eyes, and the wrought iron balconies cast jagged shadows on the walls. Clara had heard the warnings. The locals told her that some places are best left undisturbed, that the Lalaurie mansion wasn't just haunted, it was cursed. But Clara didn't believe in curses. She believed in facts, in stories that could be uncovered, documented, and explained. Ghosts, she thought, were nothing more than echoes of the past, fragments of memory lingering in places where history refused to be forgotten. With a deep breath, she stepped closer to the gates, her heart pounding. This wasn't just research, it was a pilgrimage. She'd come to peel back the layers of myth and find the truth beneath. And the mansion, silent and imposing, seemed to dare her to try. As Clara walked through the gate, the world seemed to shift. The hum of the city faded, replaced by an oppressive silence. The air grew colder, and the faint scent of decay tickled her nose. She paused, glancing back at the street, where tourists still meandered, seemingly oblivious to the house's aura. Her fingers brushed the iron bars of the gate as she pushed it open, the metal cold and unyielding under her touch. The creak of the hinges echoed unnaturally loud in the stillness. She hesitated, her instincts telling her to turn back, but her curiosity was stronger. Inside the courtyard, the atmosphere was even heavier. Weeds pushed through the cracks in the flagstone path, and the fountain at the center, once a symbol of wealth and sophistication, was dry and crumbling. A single raven perched on the edge, its beady eyes fixed on her as it let out a low, guttural croak. Clara's footsteps echoed as she approached the front door. The mansion loomed above her, its once pristine exterior marred by time and neglect. She reached into her bag, pulling out a notebook and pen, as though writing her thoughts might anchor her in reality. But her hands were trembling, the pen slipping slightly as she jotted down the date and time. She reached for the doorknob, her fingers brushing the ornate brass. For a moment, she thought she felt it move beneath her touch, a subtle vibration that sent a shiver down her spine. Shaking off the feeling, she turned the knob and pushed the door open. The interior was dark, the faint glow from the street lamps barely penetrating the heavy curtains that covered the windows. The air was stale, carrying with it the faintest hint of something metallic, like rust or blood. Clara turned on her flashlight, the beam slicing through the shadows to reveal an entryway frozen in time. The floor was made of polished wood, though it was warped and cracked in places. A grand staircase rose before her, its banister intricately carved but coated in a thick layer of dust. Portraits lined the walls, their faces blurred with age and grime. She stepped inside, her footsteps muffled by the heavy stillness of the house. "Madame Lalaurie," Clara whispered, her voice barely audible. "What secrets did you leave behind?" The door creaked shut behind her with a hollow finality, and the silence deepened. For the first time, Clara felt a flicker of doubt. This wasn't just a house. It was a graveyard of memories, each one darker than the last. And as she stood there, the oppressive weight of the mansion pressing down on her, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. Somewhere deep within the house, a faint sound echoed a whisper, too soft to make out. Clara froze, her pulse quickening. She turned her flashlight toward the source of the sound, but the beam revealed nothing but shadow. Still, she couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't alone. The Lalaurie mansion had waited decades for someone like Clara. Someone who wasn't afraid to look too closely. Someone who wouldn't leave. New Orleans is a city of contrasts, a vibrant blend of cultures and traditions, where the air is thick with jazz melodies and whispers of the supernatural. Amid the lively streets of the French Quarter stands the Lalaurie mansion, a structure so steeped in history and horror that it casts a long, dark shadow over the city's bright festivities. By day, it is a magnificent yet foreboding sight, its elegant facade hiding a grim past. By night, it becomes something else entirely, a towering figure of dread that seems alive with secrets. Legends of the mansion's sinister history have drawn thrill seekers and historians alike. They come, armed with curiosity, to peer into the windows or press their hands against the cool stone walls, hoping to feel some connection to the past. Some claim they have. Take the story of Eleanor West, a tourist from Illinois who visited the mansion during her honeymoon. She told friends that she had seen a pale woman in 19th-century attire standing at the window on the second floor. The figure didn't move, but its presence filled her with an inexplicable fear. Her eyes, Eleanor would later recount in hushed tones, they weren't human. They were black as coal. And then there was the account of Maurice Jenkins, a local handyman hired to fix a leaking pipe in the basement. He lasted only 30 minutes inside before running out, pale and drenched in sweat. I heard screaming, he explained shakily. Not just one voice, dozens. And the walls, they felt like they were breathing. Maurice refused to step foot in the mansion again. But perhaps the most chilling accounts come from those who don't leave the mansion unscathed. People who claim that the very air inside carries a weight, pressing down on visitors until their minds fracture. Rumors swirl of individuals who have spent the night there, only to wake screaming, unable to explain what they saw. It is this mix of legend and reality that draws Clara Hensley, a true crime author searching for her next big story. Clara has spent years delving into humanity's darkest chapters, chronicling tales of serial killers, unexplained disappearances, and haunted places. Yet none have intrigued her as much as the story of Madame Delphine Lalaurie and her infamous mansion. For weeks, Clara had been unable to shake the image of the house from her mind. She first encountered its grim history in an old book of American hauntings, a brief passage detailing the atrocities that occurred within its walls. It described Madame Lalaurie as a woman of immense wealth and social standing who hid a monstrous secret behind her charming smile. A woman who, according to whispers, subjected her slaves to horrific punishments and unspeakable cruelty. The fire that exposed her crimes, the mob that stormed her home, and the enigmatic escape of Madame Lalaurie herself, all of it fascinated Clara. But what truly intrigued her were the unanswered questions. What happened to Lalaurie after she fled? Did she die as the stories claimed, or was her escape even darker than the crimes she left behind? Determined to find out, Clara booked a flight to New Orleans. She had no illusions about the mansion's reputation. Ghost stories had never scared her, she considered herself a realist. To her, the mansion wasn't haunted by spirits but by history, a history she intended to uncover. Yet, from the moment she arrived in New Orleans, something felt off. The locals she spoke to during her research avoided talking about the mansion. Some would shake their heads, muttering, "Bad things happen to people who poke around that place." Others outright refused to engage, crossing themselves as they walked away. One particularly ominous warning came from an elderly woman selling trinkets in the French market. "Child," she said, gripping Clara's hand with surprising strength, "there are doors in this world you don't want to open. That house. It's not just cursed, it's hungry." Clara brushed off the warnings, chalking them up to superstition, but the words lingered in the back of her mind as she approached the mansion for the first time. Standing before it, she felt an unexpected chill. The air seemed heavier here, the street quieter, as if even the city itself was avoiding the mansion's shadow. Its windows, dark and lifeless, seemed to watch her. The wrought iron gates, intricate yet menacing, stood as the only barrier between her and the house. Clara hesitated, gripping the strap of her bag tightly. The historian in her whispered that this was just a building, bricks and mortar. But another voice, deeper and more primal, urged her to turn back. Ignoring the unease creeping up her spine, Clara stepped forward. She pushed open the gate, the metal groaning in protest, and began her journey into the mansion's dark embrace. Unbeknownst to her, the Lalaurie mansion had been waiting. The carriage lanterns hanging from the wrought iron gates swayed slightly, casting faint, flickering shadows across the cobblestone street. It was nearly midnight when Amelia Watson arrived at the mansion. A respected historian and author, Amelia had spent years piecing together fragments of forgotten stories, but none had captivated her quite like the tale of Madame Delphine Lalaurie and her infamous House of Horrors. Her fascination bordered on obsession, driving her to New Orleans in search of answers no textbook or archived record could provide. The mansion loomed before her, its facade a haunting blend of elegance and decay. The windows were dark, their glass panes smeared with grime, yet they seemed to shimmer faintly in the moonlight, as though hiding secrets just beyond view. The air around the house felt heavy, suffused with an unnatural chill that prickled the back of her neck. Her footsteps echoed as she approached the grand double doors, now reinforced with heavy locks and chains to keep trespassers at bay. It had taken weeks of negotiations to gain access to the building after hours. The tour operator, a wiry man with an unshakable superstition, had warned her. "Spend as much time as you like during the day, Miss Watson. But at night, this house has a way of making people regret their curiosity." She dismissed his warning with polite skepticism, though now, standing before the door, she hesitated. It felt as though the house itself were daring her to enter. The key rattled in the lock, the door groaning loudly as it creaked open. Inside, the air was colder still, thick with the scent of mildew and something faintly metallic like old blood. Amelia fumbled with her flashlight, its beam cutting through the oppressive gloom to reveal the grand foyer. The marble floors were cracked and uneven, the walls stained with watermarks that ran like veins across the plaster. Her research had prepared her for what she might find, remnants of the opulence that once defined the Lalaurie estate: a crystal chandelier dangling precariously, its crystals dulled by time, ornate banisters on the staircase, their wood warped and splintered. But no amount of preparation could quell the unease that settled over her as she stepped inside. She began her exploration methodically, moving from room to room and taking notes in her leather-bound journal. The parlor was grand yet unsettling, with a large mirror dominating one wall. Its glass was cracked in places, distorting her reflection into a fragmented version of herself. She quickly averted her eyes, feeling an inexplicable sense of dread. Upstairs, the unease deepened. The second floor housed the infamous attic where, according to the reports of 1834, the enslaved were imprisoned and tortured. Amelia ascended the staircase slowly, her flashlight trembling slightly in her grip. The steps creaked loudly beneath her weight, each sound echoing into the suffocating silence. At the top of the stairs, the hallway stretched endlessly before her. The doors to the rooms on either side were closed, their brass knobs tarnished and dull. She tried the first door on the left. It opened easily, revealing a small bedroom with a rotted four-poster bed and a broken vanity. A child's doll lay on the floor, its porcelain face cracked, one glassy eye staring up at her accusingly. A sudden noise behind her made her jump, a faint creak, like the sound of footsteps. She swung her flashlight around, illuminating the empty hallway. Her breath quickened, and she scolded herself under her breath. "It's an old house. Old houses make noise. But as she turned back to her notes, the footsteps came again, closer this time. Slow, deliberate. Hello. She called out, her voice trembling. It echoed back to her, empty and mocking. Summoning her courage, she stepped into the hallway and shone her flashlight in both directions. Still nothing. Yet the air felt charged now, electric, as though she were being watched. The faint scent of smoke tickled her nostrils, mingling with the metallic tang that had lingered since she entered the house. Determined to press on, she reached the end of the hallway and found the door to the attic. The iron latch was rusted, and it took considerable effort to pry it open. When the door finally gave way, it released a gust of icy air that made her gasp. She hesitated before climbing the narrow staircase, the wooden steps groaning in protest. The attic was dark, the flashlight's beam struggling to cut through the thick shadows. It was a barren, suffocating space, the walls lined with rusted hooks and chains. In one corner lay a pile of debris, broken furniture, scraps of fabric, and what looked disturbingly like human bones. Amelia's stomach turned, and she took an involuntary step back. As she did, the attic door slammed shut behind her with a deafening bang. Her flashlight flickered, the shadows seeming to grow thicker and more oppressive. She spun around, her pulse pounding in her ears, and froze. A faint, almost imperceptible whisper broke the silence. It was low and guttural, like a voice struggling to escape from a throat long since rotted away. "Why are you here?" The words sent a chill through her body, and she stumbled backward, her hands shaking as she gripped the flashlight. The beam landed on one of the hooks on the wall, and for a brief moment, she saw what looked like a blood-stained shackle dangling from it. "Who's there?" she demanded, her voice breaking. The whisper came again, louder this time, echoing all around her. "You don't belong." The shadows seemed to shift, taking on shapes, figures hunched and contorted, their hollow eyes glowing faintly. Amelia backed away, her heart racing as the figures grew closer, surrounding her. The metallic scent grew stronger, nearly choking her. Desperation overtook her as she clawed at the attic door, but it wouldn't budge. The whispers turned to low wails, and the figures loomed closer, their faces twisted in agony. One reached out, its hand skeletal and blackened, and grazed her arm. The touch burned like ice, and she screamed, yanking her arm away. The last thing she saw before her flashlight died completely was a pair of glowing eyes staring at her from the darkest corner of the attic, unblinking and full of malice. The mansion seemed to exhale, the sound reverberating through the walls like a satisfied sigh. The Lalaurie mansion towered above Rue Royale like a grim sentinel, its aged facade weathered by time yet somehow still exuding an undeniable air of malevolence. Despite its grand architecture, the house seemed to repel rather than attract, as if daring anyone to come closer. Amanda Graves, a seasoned historian and author, stood at the iron gate clutching her leather-bound notebook. The whispers of the mansion's history had drawn her to New Orleans, but now, staring at the looming structure, she couldn't help but feel the weight of her decision. Amanda had always prided herself on being rational. She'd written extensively about America's darkest historical mysteries, traveling from the Salem witch trials to the haunted hills of Gettysburg. But there was something uniquely sinister about the Lalaurie mansion, a depth of horror that seemed almost sentient. Stories of Delphine Lalaurie's atrocities had captivated her, but the whispers about what lingered in the house after her disappearance had unsettled even Amanda. When she approached the housekeeper earlier that day, a woman named Lucille, who was paid to maintain the empty mansion, she was met with a firm warning. "Miss Graves," Lucille had said, her voice low and cautious, "you may research all you like, but don't step inside that house after dark. The walls remember, and they do not forgive." Amanda brushed off the comment, attributing it to local superstition. She'd heard similar warnings from locals during her travels to other purportedly haunted places. But now, standing before the mansion, She couldn't shake the chill running up her spine. After a moment of hesitation, Amanda pushed open the heavy wrought iron gate and made her way up the brick pathway. The door creaked ominously as it swung open under her touch, revealing a grand but decayed interior. The air inside was cold, unnaturally so, and carried the faint, sickly scent of mildew and decay. Dust particles floated lazily in the dim light streaming through cracked shutters. Amanda set up her recording equipment in the grand foyer, the ornate chandelier above her swaying slightly, though there was no breeze. She narrated into her recorder, her voice steady despite the growing unease in her chest. "This is Amanda Graves, documenting my research into the history of the Lalaurie mansion," she began. "The house is eerily silent. Though no physical evidence of hauntings has ever been captured here, accounts of spectral activity span nearly 2 centuries. Tonight, I will attempt to uncover the truth." As the hours wore on, Amanda meticulously explored the house, her footsteps echoing on the wooden floorboards. She marveled at the architecture, pausing occasionally to jot down notes about the craftsmanship and style. But no matter where she went, a feeling of being watched gnawed at her. The sensation grew stronger in the upstairs parlor. The room was suffocating, its air heavy and oppressive. As Amanda examined a grand piano, her eyes fell on a chair in the corner. It was slightly askew, facing the piano as though someone had been seated there moments before. She froze. Hadn't that chair been tucked neatly under the window earlier? Shaking her head, Amanda dismissed the thought. The mind plays tricks in places like this, she reasoned. But as she turned back to her equipment, she swore she heard the faintest sound of piano keys, a single note, soft and deliberate. Amanda whipped around, but the piano sat silent, its lid closed and covered in dust. Her heartbeat quickened. She told herself it was her imagination, but her growing unease made her decide to leave the parlor and head for the upper floors. The stairway creaked under her weight as she ascended, the darkness above swallowing her whole. The second floor was colder, the chill biting into her skin. Her flashlight's beam swept across the walls, revealing ornate moldings and faded wallpaper. She paused outside a door at the end of the hall, its surface scarred with deep scratches. Pushing it open, Amanda stepped into a small bedroom. The room was barren except for a single bed frame and a shattered mirror leaning against the wall. She felt a wave of nausea as the air grew thicker, the faint scent of burning wood filling her nostrils. She turned on her recorder again. "This room, it feels different. The atmosphere is heavier, almost alive." Suddenly, the temperature dropped further, her breath now visible in the dim light. A low creak came from behind her, and she spun around, expecting to find the door moving. But it wasn't the door. The mirror. The cracked surface of the mirror reflected not just Amanda but the faint outline of another figure, tall, thin, and shadowy, standing just behind her. Her blood turned to ice as she turned abruptly, but the room was empty. She moved closer to the mirror, her hand trembling as she reached out to touch its jagged edge. As her fingers brushed against the cold glass, she heard it, a faint, anguished whisper. "Help us." Amanda stumbled back, her heart racing. The whisper grew louder, joined by others. The voices overlapped, creating a cacophony of despair that filled the room. She grabbed her recorder and fled, her footsteps pounding down the hall. Reaching the grand staircase, she froze mid-step. The chandelier, which had been swaying gently earlier, now swung violently, its glass shards rattling like bones. She backed away, gripping the banister for support, but the whispers followed her. They grew louder, angrier, as though the house itself was coming alive. Then she heard it, heavy footsteps descending the stairs above her. Slowly, deliberately. Amanda turned, her flashlight illuminating the staircase. No one was there. The footsteps grew closer, louder. Her breath came in shallow gasps as she bolted down the stairs, her bag slamming against her side. She reached the foyer, fumbling with the equipment she'd set up earlier. Her hands trembled so badly she dropped the recorder. And then, silence. Amanda stood frozen, her back pressed against the door. The whispers had stopped, the footsteps gone. All that remained was the sound of her own frantic breathing. Just as she reached for the doorknob, a woman's voice cut through the stillness. "You shouldn't have come." The words echoed in her ears, dripping with malice. Amanda turned slowly, her flashlight revealing the empty room behind her. The voice came again, louder, closer. "Leave. Now." Amanda didn't wait for a third warning. She threw open the door and fled into the night, her pulse racing as the mansion loomed behind her. But as she ran, she couldn't shake the feeling that something or someone was watching her, its eyes following her every step. The historian, Dr. Eleanor Marks, wasn't one to believe in ghost stories. Her fascination with the Lalaurie mansion stemmed from a desire to uncover the truth buried beneath decades of myth and folklore. Arriving in New Orleans, she was greeted by the city's vibrant streets, a sharp contrast to the cold, ominous figure of the mansion waiting for her on Royal Street. The house loomed in the distance as she approached, its wrought iron balconies covered in shadows cast by the faint glow of the streetlights. Eleanor had secured a temporary pass to study the mansion at night, a rare privilege granted after she convinced the Historical Society of her academic intentions. Standing at the door, she hesitated. The silence was profound, an unnatural stillness that seemed to ripple out from the mansion itself. With a steadying breath, she turned the old brass key in the lock and stepped inside. The air hit her immediately stagnant, heavy, almost damp. It smelled of age, rot, and something metallic that she couldn't quite place. The floorboards groaned under her weight as she moved through the dimly lit entryway. She set her bag on the floor and pulled out her recorder, speaking her first thoughts aloud to capture her impressions. Entering the Lalaurie mansion, she began, her voice unnaturally loud in the empty space. "The atmosphere is oppressive. I can understand why so many claim it's haunted. The history here feels alive, even without any obvious paranormal activity." As she wandered deeper into the mansion, Eleanor couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. The grand staircase rose before her, its polished wood gleaming faintly in the dim light. She paused at the base, staring up into the darkness above. Her flashlight flickered briefly, a small hiccup that made her stomach tighten. "Old wiring," she muttered to herself, trying to sound casual. But deep down, she felt the first inkling of unease. She climbed the stairs slowly, each creak of the wood beneath her feet echoing through the vast, empty halls. Reaching the second floor, she found herself drawn to a door at the end of the hallway. It was slightly ajar, as though someone had left in a hurry or wanted her to enter. Eleanor pushed the door open, revealing a room that seemed untouched by time. Dust coated every surface, and an ornate chandelier hung precariously from the ceiling. In the center of the room stood a single chair, its leather seat cracked and weathered. On the floor beneath it, faint scratch marks marred the wooden planks, as if something or someone had been dragged across them. She knelt to examine the marks, her breath catching as she noticed small, rust-colored stains trailing off toward the far wall. Blood. No, she thought, shaking her head. It could be anything: paint, rust, even wine. Rising to her feet, she turned her attention to a large mirror hanging on the wall. Its surface was clouded with age, but something about it drew her in. She stepped closer, peering into its depths. For a moment, she saw only her own reflection, distorted and faint. Then, movement. A shadow flickered behind her, just at the edge of her vision. She spun around, flashlight in hand, but the room was empty. Her pulse quickened as she turned back to the mirror, now noticing something else: fingerprints, faint but undeniable, smeared across the glass from the inside. A cold chill crept down her spine as she whispered into her recorder, "There's something strange about this room. The mirror, it feels wrong." I don't know how else to describe it. Suddenly, the door behind her slammed shut with a deafening bang. She gasped, her heart leaping into her throat. Whipping around, she tried the handle, but it wouldn't budge. "Hello," she called out, her voice trembling. "Is anyone there?" The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the faint sound of scratching. It was coming from the walls, soft and intermittent, like nails dragging against wood. Eleanor pressed her ear to the surface, straining to hear, when a faint whisper pierced the quiet. "Help us." She stumbled back, her blood running cold. The voice was faint, barely audible, but unmistakable. Swallowing hard, she fumbled for her recorder. "Unexplained phenomena," she said shakily. Whispering, coming from the walls. "Possible auditory hallucination, but," she trailed off, unable to convince even herself. The scratching grew louder, more insistent, as if something were clawing its way toward her. Eleanor's flashlight began to flicker again, the beam stuttering and fading. Panic set in as she backed away from the wall, her breath coming in shallow gasps. Then, the scratching stopped. The silence was almost worse. She stood frozen, listening intently, when a loud thud echoed from the room below her. It was followed by another, and another, each one growing louder and closer. She bolted for the door, yanking on the handle with all her strength. It finally gave way, and she stumbled into the hallway, her flashlight swinging wildly as she ran. The pounding continued, following her as she descended the stairs, her footsteps echoing in time with the relentless thuds. Reaching the entryway, Eleanor grabbed her bag and turned to leave, but the door refused to open. She twisted the knob furiously, her desperation mounting. "Let me out," she screamed, pounding on the door. Behind her, the air grew colder, and the unmistakable sound of footsteps crept closer. Turning slowly, she saw them shadows pooling at the base of the staircase, stretching toward her like fingers. They moved unnaturally, twisting and writhing as they climbed the walls, filling the room with an oppressive darkness. Eleanor backed against the door, her flashlight trembling in her grip. She couldn't look away as the shadows formed into figures, their faces twisted in anguish, their eyes hollow and unseeing. A voice echoed through the room, low and guttural. "Stay with us." Her scream was swallowed by the darkness as the shadows surged forward. The streets of the French Quarter seemed alive as dusk fell, every sound and shadow amplified in the humid, buzzing air of New Orleans. Emma Delacroix, a historian with an unquenchable thirst for untold stories, stepped off the curb and stood before the Lalaurie mansion. Its imposing facade loomed over her, the weathered gray walls and shuttered windows exuding an eerie kind of silence that felt out of place amid the vibrant city around it. She had read the stories, devoured the records, and pieced together fragments of whispers from locals who refused to speak too much about the place. The Lalaurie mansion was a wound in the city's history, its past too dark for even the boldest storytellers to recount without a chill running down their spine. But Emma wasn't here for legends, she was here for the truth. With a deep breath, she crossed the threshold into the mansion, stepping into a space where time seemed to stand still. Dust motes floated in the air like frozen stars, illuminated by thin streams of twilight breaking through the cracks in the shutters. The atmosphere was suffocating, heavy with a silence so absolute that even her footsteps sounded muted. The main hall was grand, or at least, it must have been at one time. A broken chandelier hung like a skeletal hand from the high ceiling, and the marble floor beneath her feet was cracked and stained with a history no amount of scrubbing could erase. Emma's fingers itched to take notes, but the weight of the room pressed down on her, making every movement feel laborious. She set her bag down on a nearby table, its wood warped and discolored by years of neglect, and pulled out her voice recorder. "This is Emma Delacroix, recording from the infamous Lalaurie mansion," she began, her voice sounding too loud in the cavernous room. I'll be spending the night here to document the truth behind the myths and ghost stories that have surrounded this place for nearly 2 centuries. As her words hung in the air, the silence that followed felt almost accusatory, as though the mansion itself were displeased with her intrusion. Shaking off the unease, Emma walked deeper into the house. The first sign that something was wrong came as she ascended the grand staircase. The wooden steps creaked beneath her weight, but one particular step emitted a groan so loud it sounded almost human. She paused, her hand gripping the banister, and looked back down the staircase. The front door remained closed, the dim light of the evening barely penetrating the gloom. Shrugging it off, she continued upward, her footsteps slower now, as if her body were instinctively bracing for something. The second floor was darker, the air colder, and as she reached the landing, she noticed a faint smell, an acrid, metallic scent that made her stomach churn. Maybe the plumbing, she muttered to herself, though she knew it was a poor excuse for the stench that lingered. The hallway stretched before her, lined with doors that seemed to stare at her like empty eye sockets. Emma chose the first door on the left, turning the knob slowly. The room inside was sparse, its furniture covered in dust and cobwebs. A broken mirror hung crookedly on the far wall, its cracked surface reflecting her distorted image back at her. She stepped inside, her recorder still running, and began to describe the room. That's when she heard it. A faint scraping sound, like nails dragging across wood. It came from the corner of the room, where shadows pooled unnaturally despite the fading daylight. Emma froze, her breath catching in her throat. She scanned the corner, but nothing was there, just a pile of old furniture draped in yellowed sheets. "Hello," she called out, her voice trembling slightly. The sound stopped, replaced by a deafening silence that pressed against her eardrums. For a moment, she considered leaving the room, but curiosity won out. She approached the corner cautiously, her hand reaching out to pull back the sheet that covered what appeared to be a chair. As the fabric fell away, Emma jumped back, her heart racing. The chair was an antique, its wooden arms carved with grotesque faces twisted in expressions of agony. Deep scratches marred the seat, as if someone or something had clawed at it in desperation. Suddenly, the air shifted, and a chill swept through the room. Emma shivered, clutching her jacket tighter around her. She turned back toward the door, intending to leave, but it was closed. "I didn't close that," she whispered, panic creeping into her voice. Her footsteps quickened as she crossed the room and grabbed the doorknob. It was ice cold, and when she tried to turn it, it wouldn't budge. A loud bang echoed behind her, and she spun around to see the broken mirror rattling against the wall. Her voice recorder, still running, captured the tremor in her words as she said, This isn't normal. I need to get out of here." Another sound echoed through the hallway, a faint whisper, unintelligible but undeniably there. Emma pressed her ear to the door, straining to make out the words, but they were distorted, overlapping as though multiple voices were speaking at once. Then came the laughter. Soft at first, almost like a child's giggle, but it grew louder, more sinister, echoing through the empty house. Emma backed away from the door, her heart pounding in her chest. "This isn't happening," she said to herself, clutching the recorder as though it could protect her. The whispers grew louder, merging into one voice that hissed, "You shouldn't be here." The doorknob turned on its own, and the door creaked open slowly, revealing the dark hallway beyond. Emma stared into the shadows, her breath shallow and uneven. She stepped into the hallway, her flashlight flickering as though the batteries were dying. The whispers continued, coming from every direction now, wrapping around her like a suffocating fog. She turned toward the staircase, but the way down seemed impossibly long, the shadows stretching unnaturally across the steps. A loud thud from behind her made her whip around. The door to the room she had just left was swinging open and shut, slamming against the frame with enough force to splinter the wood. And then she saw it. A figure at the end of the hallway, tall and shrouded in darkness. Its head tilted unnaturally, and its eyes glowed faintly, like embers in the void. It didn't move, but Emma felt its gaze pierce through her. Her legs felt like lead as she stumbled backward, her mind screaming at her to run, but her body frozen in place. The figure took a single step forward, and the shadows around it seemed to ripple, distorting the hallway like a heat wave. Emma turned and bolted for the stairs, her flashlight bouncing wildly as she ran. The whispers turned into screams, echoing through the mansion like a chorus of the damned. She didn't dare look back, even as the air behind her grew colder, as though the figure were right on her heels. She reached the bottom of the staircase and threw open the front door, gasping for air as she stumbled out into the night. But the moment she stepped onto the street, the world around her felt wrong, too quiet, too still. And when she turned back to look at the mansion, the windows glowed faintly with an unnatural light, and she could swear she saw figures moving behind the glass. The whispers hadn't stopped. They followed her, carried by the wind, whispering her name. The historian, Evelyn Carr, arrived in New Orleans on a cloudy afternoon, the kind of day where the thick humidity pressed against her skin like an invisible hand. She had spent years studying the dark history of slavery in the American South, but the Lalaurie mansion was different. It wasn't just a chapter in her upcoming book, it was an obsession. The whispers surrounding the mansion's gruesome history had seeped into her dreams, leaving her with fragmented images of chained figures and a woman's chilling laughter echoing through shadowy halls. The mansion stood before her now, its grand facade cracked and weathered by time, as if the building itself bore the scars of its horrifying past. She lingered outside, clutching her notebook tightly, and took a deep breath. There was something unspoken in the air, a tension that settled in her chest like a weight. Her research had already uncovered more than the usual macabre details about Delphine Lalaurie's life. Beyond the atrocities, the fire, and her sudden disappearance, there were rumors of cursed objects, whispers of seances conducted by desperate families trying to reach the spirits trapped within, and unexplained deaths linked to those who lingered too long in its halls. These were stories she had dismissed as folklore, exaggerated tales meant to feed the city's hunger for ghost stories. Yet now, standing at the threshold, she wasn't so sure. Evelyn pushed the heavy wooden door open, its hinges groaning as if reluctant to let her in. The interior was eerily quiet. Dust motes floated lazily in the air, illuminated by the dim afternoon light filtering through tall, dirty windows. She had arranged to rent the space for a week, a privilege granted only to those willing to pay a hefty sum. It was worth every penny to immerse herself in this haunting space. The first night passed without incident. She explored the empty rooms, her footsteps echoing in the vast, hollow spaces. The walls seemed to hum faintly, almost imperceptibly, as if they held secrets they were desperate to share. Evelyn found herself drawn to the grand staircase, her hand trailing along the wooden banister worn smooth by decades of use. She stopped halfway up, feeling a sudden chill creep up her spine. It wasn't the air, it was something else, an unshakable sensation that she was being watched. She turned sharply, scanning the empty foyer below, but there was nothing there. The house was still. Shrugging off the unease, she returned to her room for the night, where her laptop sat open, waiting for her to begin writing. By the third day, the strangeness began. It started with small things: a cold breeze brushing past her in a room with no windows open, the faint sound of footsteps echoing down the hall when she knew she was alone. Her equipment, carefully laid out to document any paranormal activity, would inexplicably stop recording. Her notebooks were moved from the desk to the floor, pages dog-eared as though someone or something had been reading them. She convinced herself it was her imagination. After all, the mind could play tricks in a place like this. Then came the night she heard the laughter. It was faint at first, barely a whisper, but unmistakable. A woman's laugh, soft and lilting, as if it were coming from a distant room. Evelyn froze in place, her pen hovering above the page of notes she had been furiously scribbling. She held her breath, straining to hear more, but the sound faded as quickly as it had come. "Hello," she called out, her voice trembling. The house responded with silence. The rational part of her mind screamed to leave, but curiosity won over fear. She grabbed a flashlight and followed the sound, her heart pounding in her chest. The laughter had seemed to come from the upper floor, the very rooms where Lalaurie's tortured victims had been found. As she climbed the staircase, the air grew heavier, thicker. The faint hum she'd heard before was louder now, almost like a low, guttural growl resonating through the walls. She reached the top landing and turned down the hallway, where a row of doors stood ominously ajar. She paused before the largest door at the end of the hall, her hand hovering over the knob. Her instincts told her to turn back, to leave the mansion altogether, but something compelled her to push forward. The door creaked open, revealing a room bathed in shadows. At first glance, the room seemed empty, save for an ornate mirror hanging on the far wall. Its surface was cracked, spider-webbed with fractures that distorted the faint reflection of her flashlight. Evelyn stepped closer, drawn to the mirror despite the unease curling in her gut. As she approached, her reflection flickered. She stopped abruptly, her breath catching in her throat. It wasn't her reflection, it was a woman's face. Pale, with dark, hollow eyes, her lips curled into a cruel smile. Evelyn stumbled back, her flashlight clattering to the floor. The room plunged into darkness, save for the faint moonlight streaming through the window. The laughter returned, louder this time, filling the room with a mocking, bone-chilling cadence. "Who's there?" Evelyn demanded, her voice cracking as she fumbled to pick up her flashlight. The mirror seemed to pulse, the cracks shifting and twisting into grotesque shapes. The laughter ceased abruptly, replaced by a low, menacing whisper. "You shouldn't have come." Evelyn's blood turned to ice as the shadows in the room began to move, coalescing into shapes that seemed almost human. The air grew colder still, her breath visible in the dim light. The whispering grew louder, overlapping voices echoing in languages she didn't understand. She stumbled out of the room, slamming the door behind her. As she ran back down the hallway, the walls seemed to close in, the faint hum now a deafening roar. She didn't stop until she reached her room, locking the door and pressing her back against it as she struggled to catch her breath. For the first time since she arrived, Evelyn questioned whether she had made a mistake. Whatever lived in the Lalaurie mansion wasn't just a memory of the past, it was alive, and it knew she was there. The city of New Orleans hummed with life as the historian, Eleanor Grant, arrived with a leather-bound notebook in hand and an insatiable curiosity etched across her face. Her obsession with the Lalaurie mansion had grown over months of poring through archives, reading eyewitness accounts, and listening to whispered tales of terror passed down through generations. This wasn't just a visit to satisfy her curiosity, it was a journey into the past to uncover the secrets that even history dared not tell. Eleanor's rented room sat just a block away from the infamous mansion. The walls of her quaint lodging trembled slightly with the vibrations of distant jazz music and the clinking of glasses from nearby taverns. But that night, the lively ambience of the French Quarter couldn't drown out the weight of her thoughts. She spent hours reviewing her notes, her fingers brushing over the grainy photographs of the mansion, the cracked plaster of its walls, and its shuttered windows that seemed to hide more than they revealed. The next morning, she stood in front of the mansion, a structure both grand and menacing. Its grey facade was worn with age, and the shutters hung slightly askew, as if even the house was weary from the weight of its history. A plaque by the entrance gave a brief, sanitized version of its past, but Eleanor knew the real stories were far darker than words on bronze could capture. As she pushed open the door, having obtained special access through an agreement with the Historical Society, a musty scent enveloped her. The air was heavy, stale, and carried the faint, acrid tang of something burnt. She paused, letting her eyes adjust to the dim interior, her footsteps echoing on the wooden floor. Each creak seemed amplified, as if the house itself was groaning in protest at her intrusion. The first few hours passed uneventfully as Eleanor explored the first floor, taking careful notes of the architecture and layout. The parlor was still adorned with ornate moldings and a crumbling chandelier, though the furniture had long been removed. In the kitchen, the faint outline of a dumbwaiter remained, its pulley system rusted and immobile. It wasn't until she ascended the creaking staircase to the second floor that she felt it a shift in the air. The upstairs hallway was suffocatingly narrow, its walls pressing in on either side. Doors lined the corridor, each one closed tight. The first room she entered was empty except for an old wardrobe and a shattered mirror leaning against the wall. As she approached the mirror, something caught her eye, a flicker of movement. She froze, her breath hitching as she stared into the fractured glass. It was her own reflection, or so she thought. The fragmented image stared back, but there was something wrong. Her reflection's eyes seemed darker, the pupils almost impossibly large, and its expression was twisted with something Eleanor couldn't quite name. Fear. Hatred. Despair. She blinked, and the image was normal again. Shaking her head, she muttered, "Just nerves," and moved on. The next room was worse. It was smaller, with no windows, and the air inside was colder than it had any right to be on a humid Louisiana afternoon. In the center of the floor lay a faint outline, a dark stain seared into the wood. Kneeling down, Eleanor traced the edge of the mark with her fingers. It was oddly sticky, as if the stain had never fully dried, even after all these years. Suddenly, the door behind her slammed shut. She jolted, her notebook falling from her hands. Whirling around, she reached for the doorknob, but it wouldn't budge. A low, guttural whisper filled the room, seeming to emanate from the very walls themselves. "Get out." Eleanor stumbled back, her pulse racing. Her eyes darted around the room, but there was no one there. The whisper faded, replaced by the sound of distant, faint screams, agonized, desperate cries that seemed to come from beneath her feet. She pressed her hands to her ears, trying to block it out, but the sound only grew louder, filling her head until it was unbearable. Then, as quickly as it had started, it stopped. The door creaked open on its own, as if inviting her to leave. Trembling, Eleanor stumbled back into the hallway, her mind racing. But she didn't leave. She couldn't. Not yet. The next room was the largest on the second floor, and it bore the faint remnants of its former opulence: elaborate crown moldings, faded wallpaper, and a fireplace blackened with soot. Above the mantel was an empty frame, its canvas long gone. Eleanor felt drawn to the space, as if something there demanded her attention. As she stepped closer, a sudden chill swept through the room, and her breath turned visible in the freezing air. Her notebook fell open on the floor, its pages flipping wildly, though there was no breeze. She bent to pick it up, and that's when she saw it, a shadow in the corner of her eye. It wasn't just a shadow, it was a figure. Turning slowly, she saw the outline of a woman, her dress tattered and filthy, standing in the far corner of the room. Her face was obscured, but her posture was unnatural, her head tilted at an impossible angle. The figure didn't move, didn't breathe, but Eleanor felt its gaze piercing through her, cold and relentless. "Who are you?" Eleanor whispered, her voice trembling. The figure didn't respond, but as Eleanor stepped closer, it vanished. No puff of smoke, no flicker of light, just gone. But the chill in the air remained, and the oppressive weight of the room bore down on her like a suffocating shroud. She tried to rationalize it, to convince herself that it was just her imagination, but deep down, she knew the truth. She wasn't alone. And the mansion wasn't just haunted, it was alive, and it was watching her. The historian, Dr. Emily Kavanagh, had spent years chasing the stories behind America's most haunted locations. Her fascination with the macabre had started as a mere academic interest but had grown into a full-blown obsession. When she heard about the Lalaurie mansion, she knew this was the story that could make her career or possibly break her. Emily arrived in New Orleans on a muggy, overcast afternoon. The mansion stood at the end of Royal Street, its weathered facade both imposing and alluring. The wrought iron balconies seemed to sag under the weight of history, their intricate designs twisted like the stories tied to the house. The air around the mansion was heavy, as if time itself had settled over the place and refused to move on. She secured a stay in a nearby boutique hotel, close enough to keep the mansion in view from her window. Every night, she sat at her desk, poring over archives, historical records, and witness accounts of the mansion's grisly past. Each story was more horrifying than the last, the screams heard echoing at night, the strange lights seen flickering in the upper windows, and the unexplained deaths of those who dared to live within its walls. Emily's days were spent interviewing locals. Many were hesitant to talk about the mansion, their faces darkening with unease at the mention of its name. An elderly woman, one of the few who dared to speak, warned her in a raspy whisper, "That house doesn't want to be disturbed. It takes pieces of those who get too close." But Emily dismissed the warnings. She was here for answers, not ghost stories. One evening, as the rain poured in sheets against her hotel window, she decided it was time to visit the mansion. Armed with her notebook, voice recorder, and an old leather satchel filled with research materials, she approached the grand iron gates. The tour guide she had contacted earlier was waiting for her, though he seemed uneasy. "I usually don't do private tours this late," he muttered, his eyes darting toward the mansion. "But, if you're sure you want to go inside, I'll take you." The interior was just as Emily had imagined, dark, cold, and steeped in an oppressive stillness. The grand staircase loomed ahead, its banister polished but the steps creaking underfoot as if protesting their intrusion. Faint whiffs of lavender and something metallic lingered in the air. "This is the room where they found the slaves," the guide whispered as they entered a large, barren space on the second floor. He gestured to the far corner, his voice trembling. "Chained to the walls, tortured for years. People say the screams never really stopped." Emily moved closer, her flashlight revealing faint scratches on the walls. She traced her fingers over the markings, trying to imagine the terror that had once filled this room. A sudden chill prickled her skin, and she turned sharply, feeling as though someone was watching her. The guide cleared his throat nervously. "I'll wait downstairs," he said. "Call me if you need me." Without waiting for a response, he hurried off, leaving Emily alone. She remained in the room, taking notes and recording her observations. Her voice echoed eerily in the space, each word swallowed by the darkness. Then, as she reviewed her notes, she heard a faint, almost imperceptible sound. A soft scraping noise, like nails dragging against the floor. Emily froze, her pen hovering above the page. "Is someone there?" she called out, her voice firmer than she felt. Silence. She turned her flashlight toward the source of the sound, but the room was empty. Shaking off her nerves, she muttered, "It's just my imagination." But as she continued her work, the noises grew louder. Now it was a faint whispering, too soft to make out the words but unmistakably human. She turned on her recorder and pointed it toward the direction of the sound. "Can you hear me?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Is someone trying to communicate?" The whispers stopped abruptly. The silence that followed was deafening, pressing down on her like a weight. Then, just as she began to relax, she heard a loud bang from the hallway. Her heart leapt into her throat as she hurried to the doorway, her flashlight cutting through the dark corridor. The beam of light flickered as if struggling to stay alive. The hallway stretched out before her, long and foreboding, with closed doors lining either side. "Hello," she called out, her voice echoing. No response. She stepped into the hallway, her footsteps muffled by the thick carpet. One of the doors creaked open slightly, revealing nothing but darkness beyond. Emily hesitated, her instincts screaming at her to turn back. But her curiosity pushed her forward. As she approached the door, her flashlight dimmed again. She reached out with a trembling hand and pushed it open. The room inside was cold, colder than any other part of the mansion. A single chair sat in the center, facing a large mirror that hung on the far wall. Emily stepped inside, her breath visible in the freezing air. The mirror was ornate, its frame gilded and intricately carved with symbols she didn't recognize. She moved closer, her reflection coming into view. But something was off. Her reflection didn't match her movements. Emily's blood ran cold as she watched her mirrored self stare back at her, its expression twisted into something unnatural. Her reflection leaned forward, placing a hand against the glass, though Emily herself remained frozen in place. Then, the whispering returned louder this time, filling the room with a cacophony of voices. She clutched her head, trying to drown out the sound, but it only grew more intense. "Leave," one voice hissed, distinct and sharp. The mirror began to vibrate, the glass rippling as though it were water. Emily stumbled backward, her flashlight clattering to the floor. She turned to run, but the door slammed shut, trapping her inside. Panic surged through her as she banged on the door, screaming for help. The voices grew louder, overlapping in a chaotic symphony of anger and despair. Suddenly, the chair in the center of the room scraped against the floor, moving toward her. Emily's eyes widened as it stopped inches from her, as if inviting her to sit. And then, the mirror shattered. The room fell silent, but the shards of glass didn't hit the ground. They hovered in the air, spinning slowly before flying toward her in a whirlwind of sharp edges. She screamed as the shards surrounded her, their reflections showing twisted, horrifying images of Madame Lalaurie's victims, their faces etched with agony. The door behind her burst open, and the tour guide appeared, his face pale with terror. "We have to go," he yelled, grabbing her arm and pulling her out of the room. As they fled down the hallway, Emily glanced back. In the shattered remnants of the mirror, she saw herself, but it wasn't her. It was the reflection she had seen earlier, still staring, still smiling, as the door slammed shut behind them. The house was alive, and it wasn't finished with her yet. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the cobblestone streets of New Orleans as Amelia adjusted her scarf against the cool evening breeze. She was a historian, known for her meticulous research and a slight obsession with uncovering the untold stories behind famous locations. The Lalaurie mansion was her latest project, a place where history bled into myth, and truth was swallowed by horror. For weeks, Amelia had been buried in archives, piecing together fragmented accounts of the mansion's past. She'd read about Madame Lalaurie's lavish parties, her charm that masked unspeakable cruelty, and the infamous fire that unveiled the horrors hidden behind the mansion's grand facade. But every historical record seemed to stop at 1834, leaving a gaping hole in the story. What happened after? Why did no one document what became of Delphine Lalaurie or the house itself in the years that followed? Unable to ignore the pull of her curiosity, Amelia had traveled to New Orleans to find answers. A room at a nearby inn served as her base, but tonight, she was determined to get closer to the truth. With a leather-bound notebook in hand and a sense of dread mixed with excitement, she approached the mansion's iron gates. The house loomed before her, its dark windows like vacant eyes staring into her soul. The ornate wrought iron balcony seemed to sag under the weight of centuries of sorrow. Locals avoided the mansion, whispering about curses and ghostly figures that appeared after sundown. Even during the day, the air around the house was heavy, oppressive. As Amelia stood at the gates, the tour guide she'd spoken with earlier appeared from the shadows. His face was pale, his voice low. "You're sure you want to do this?" he asked, unlocking the gate with a reluctant twist of his wrist. "Yes," she replied, though her voice wavered slightly. "I need to see it for myself." He handed her a heavy key, its brass surface worn smooth. "Once you're inside, don't linger in any one room for too long," he warned. And whatever you do, don't go upstairs after midnight." Amelia raised an eyebrow. "Why not?" The guide hesitated. "Some doors aren't meant to be opened," he said cryptically before turning and disappearing into the fog. Steeling herself, Amelia stepped through the gate and into the mansion. The air inside was colder than she expected, and the faint scent of mildew and burnt wood lingered. She switched on her flashlight, its beam cutting through the darkness to reveal a grand staircase, its banister intricately carved but coated in a fine layer of dust. The house seemed frozen in time. Portraits with cracked frames hung crooked on the walls, their subjects staring down at her with lifeless eyes. She moved cautiously, her footsteps echoing on the hardwood floors as she explored the first floor. The parlor was eerily intact, as though it had been abandoned mid-conversation. A chaise lounge sat near the fireplace, its upholstery faded but untouched. A small table held a silver tea set, tarnished and cold. Amelia reached out to touch one of the teacups but hesitated when she felt a chill brush past her hand. Her heart raced as she turned sharply, expecting to see someone or something behind her. But the room was empty. She shook her head, convincing herself it was her imagination, and scribbled notes into her journal, furniture eerily preserved. Atmosphere heavy. Feels like being watched. As she moved through the mansion, the oppressive silence was broken only by the creaks of the old house settling. Yet, every so often, she thought she heard faint sounds, a distant whisper, the rustle of fabric, the soft patter of footsteps. In the dining room, the long table was still set for a meal that would never be eaten. Plates were arranged meticulously, and a candelabra sat at the center, its candles melted down to nubs. Amelia's flashlight flickered, and she slapped it against her palm, cursing under her breath. When the light returned, the table settings had shifted. The knife that had been parallel to the plate was now askew, pointing directly at her. Her throat tightened. "It's just the house," she whispered to herself. "Old places creak and groan. That's all." But the feeling of being watched intensified as she moved deeper into the house. She found herself drawn to the grand staircase, its steps worn smooth by countless footsteps. The guide's warning echoed in her mind, but her curiosity overpowered her fear. She ascended the stairs slowly, her flashlight revealing more portraits, faces frozen in time, their eyes following her every move. At the top of the stairs, the air was colder, heavier. A long hallway stretched before her, lined with doors on either side. Most were closed, their brass handles dull and uninviting, but one door at the end of the hall was slightly ajar. Amelia's heart pounded as she approached it. The door creaked as she pushed it open, revealing a bedroom frozen in disarray. The bed's four-poster frame was draped with tattered curtains, and the mattress sagged under decades of neglect. A vanity stood against the wall, its mirror cracked but reflecting the faint glow of her flashlight. She moved closer, her eyes drawn to the mirror. For a moment, her reflection seemed normal, tired, wide-eyed, but hers. Then it shifted. The figure in the mirror smiled, but Amelia did not. Her breath caught in her throat as the reflection raised a hand to wave at her, its movement slow and deliberate. She stumbled backward, her flashlight clattering to the floor. The room plunged into darkness, but the faint sound of laughter filled the air, soft, childlike, and coming from the hallway. Amelia fumbled for her flashlight, her hands shaking. When she finally picked it up and turned it back on, the hallway was empty, but the laughter continued, growing louder and more distorted. She turned to leave, her steps quickening, but the door at the end of the hallway slammed shut on its own. The portraits on the wall seemed to shift, their expressions twisting into sneers. One by one, the closed doors in the hallway began to creak open, revealing dark, empty rooms. A single, heavy footstep echoed behind her, and she froze. Slowly, she turned, her flashlight trembling in her hand. At the far end of the hallway, a shadowy figure stood. It was tall, its features obscured, but its presence was suffocating. Who are you?" Amelia stammered, but the figure didn't respond. Instead, it began to move toward her, its footsteps slow and deliberate. Panic overtook her, and she bolted down the stairs, her journal tucked under her arm. The house seemed to come alive as she fled, doors slamming, whispers rising to a cacophony, the air thick with malice. She reached the front door and fumbled with the key, her fingers slick with sweat. Finally, the lock clicked, and she burst into the night, gasping for air. Behind her, the mansion stood silent and still, its windows dark. But as she looked back, she could swear she saw a pale face staring down at her from the second-floor window, a face that wasn't her own. The mansion was a monument to silence. As the historian, Evelyn Marquette, stepped inside, she was struck by the heavy stillness that seemed to hang in the air like a thick curtain. The tour earlier that day had been crowded, noisy even, with enthusiastic guides spinning tales of horror for wide-eyed tourists. But now, standing alone within these ancient walls, Evelyn felt the true weight of the place. This wasn't a tourist attraction. It was a mausoleum, a tomb for secrets too dark to rest. Evelyn had been obsessed with the Lalaurie mansion for years. Her fascination began with a single photograph she'd stumbled upon in an antique shop, a sepia-toned image of a woman with piercing eyes and a faint, enigmatic smile. The shop owner had whispered the name, almost reverently, Madame Delphine Lalaurie. From that moment, Evelyn's life had been consumed by research, each new discovery pulling her deeper into the mansion's chilling history. She was here now to finish what she'd started, to write the definitive history of the Lalaurie mansion. The world knew the stories of the fire in 1834, of the enslaved victims discovered in the attic, their bodies twisted by unimaginable cruelty. But Evelyn suspected there was more, a darker truth buried beneath the layers of folklore and exaggeration. And she intended to find it. She set up her workspace in the grand parlor, her laptop and notebooks spread across a dusty table that looked as though it hadn't been touched in decades. The room was oppressive, its high ceilings and faded wallpaper giving it the feel of a forgotten cathedral. A faint chill seeped from the walls, and Evelyn found herself pulling her shawl tighter around her shoulders despite the humid New Orleans night. Her research began smoothly. Hours passed as she pored over old documents, cross-referencing names and dates, piecing together the lives of the people who had lived and died within these walls. Yet, as the night deepened, an unsettling feeling crept over her. It started with the whispers. At first, she dismissed them as her imagination. A trick of the wind, perhaps, slipping through the mansion's cracked windows. But as the hours stretched on, the whispers grew louder, more distinct. They were not the murmurs of wind or settling wood. They were voices soft, urgent, and unintelligible. Evelyn froze, her pen hovering above her notebook. Her ears strained to catch the words, but they eluded her, slipping away the moment she tried to focus on them. She shook her head, trying to dispel the unease. "You're tired," she muttered to herself, her voice unnaturally loud in the silent room. "You've been working too long." But even as she spoke, the whispers persisted, a faint chorus of despair that seemed to rise and fall with her every breath. Determined to shake off the growing unease, Evelyn stood and wandered deeper into the mansion. Her flashlight cast long, flickering shadows across the peeling wallpaper and the warped floorboards. She paused at the foot of the grand staircase, her gaze drawn upward to the second floor. The tour guide's warning from earlier echoed in her mind, "Some people say the second floor is where the spirits are strongest." She hesitated for only a moment before ascending, her footsteps loud and deliberate on the creaking stairs. The whispers grew louder as she climbed, and she swore she could hear faint sobs beneath them, a heartbreaking melody that made her chest tighten. The hallway was suffocatingly dark, the only light coming from her flashlight. She moved slowly, her fingers trailing along the faded wallpaper. Each door she passed seemed to hum with energy, as though the rooms behind them were alive, waiting. She stopped at the end of the hall, where a single door stood ajar. A faint glow emanated from within, flickering like candlelight. Evelyn's heart raced as she pushed the door open, revealing a small, cluttered study. The room was dominated by an ornate desk, its surface covered in papers yellowed with age. A single candle burned on the desk, its flame impossibly steady despite the draft that chilled the room. Evelyn stepped inside, her eyes scanning the papers. They were covered in elegant handwriting, the ink faded but still legible. Her breath caught in her throat as she recognized the name at the top of one page, Delphine Lalaurie. The papers were letters, written in French, their contents a mixture of mundane domestic concerns and chilling confessions. Evelyn's French was rusty, but she could make out enough to understand the implications. Lalaurie had written of her experiments, of her need to understand the limits of the human body and spirit. Evelyn's hands shook as she turned the pages. The words grew darker, more frantic, detailing rituals and incantations, desperate attempts to bind souls to the physical world. A phrase caught her eye, scrawled in large, jagged letters, "The house will remember. The house will hold them." The air in the room grew heavier, and Evelyn felt a sudden pressure around her chest, as though the mansion itself were closing in. The whispers became a cacophony, a deafening roar of voices screaming, pleading, accusing. Evelyn staggered back, clutching the papers to her chest. The candle on the desk flickered wildly before going out, plunging the room into darkness. "Who's there?" she demanded, her voice trembling. The only response was a low, guttural growl that seemed to come from all around her. She swung her flashlight wildly, the beam slicing through the darkness, but there was nothing there. And then, the shadows moved. They slithered along the walls, converging in the center of the room. Evelyn watched in horror as they coalesced into a figure, a tall, impossibly thin silhouette with hollow eyes that glowed faintly in the dark. It stepped toward her, its movements jerky and unnatural. Evelyn backed away, her mind racing. She clutched the letters tighter, as though they were a talisman that could protect her. "What do you want?" she whispered. The figure stopped, its hollow eyes locking onto hers. For a moment, the whispers fell silent, the room frozen in an unnatural stillness. Then, in a voice that was both a scream and a whisper, it spoke. "Leave." The word echoed in her mind, reverberating with a force that made her knees buckle. She scrambled out of the room, the papers still clutched in her hands. As she ran down the hall, the walls seemed to shift, the shadows following her like living things. She reached the staircase and stumbled down, nearly falling in her haste. The parlor was just as she had left it, but the air felt different, charged, hostile. She grabbed her bag, shoving the letters inside, and bolted for the door. As she stepped outside, the mansion seemed to sigh, its windows dark and unyielding. Evelyn didn't stop running until she reached her car, her hands shaking so badly she could barely fit the key into the ignition. As the engine roared to life, she glanced back at the mansion. In the second-story window, a pale face watched her, its hollow eyes glowing faintly in the dark. The night was suffocatingly silent as Emma, the historian, sat cross-legged on the dusty floor of the Lalaurie mansion's hidden attic. The glow from her lantern cast flickering shadows on the warped wooden walls, and every creak of the house felt like a whisper in the darkness. In her hands was the journal, yellowed, cracked, and bound with a brittle leather strap. It had been tucked away in a false bottom of an old trunk, hidden so meticulously that she nearly missed it. She hesitated before opening it. The initials DLL were faintly embossed on the cover, and her breath hitched. Madame Delphine Lalaurie. The infamous name sent shivers down her spine. As a historian, Emma had spent months trying to piece together the truth of the Lalaurie mansion, but the stories were fragmented, distorted by time and fear. This journal, however, could be the missing key, the raw, unfiltered words of the woman herself. The air grew heavier as she carefully untied the strap and opened the first page. The ink was faded but legible, the elegant cursive a chilling reminder of the woman who wrote it. June 1832. The screams have grown softer now. They no longer resist as much. It is better this way, they are easier to manage. Easier to mold. Emma's hands trembled, the journal nearly slipping from her grasp. The words were cruel, cold, devoid of remorse. She turned the page. July 1833. Tonight, the experiment proved fruitful. His cries ceased after the third hour, but the reaction was remarkable. The others will learn from this. They will obey, or they will endure the same. A sudden gust of wind howled through the attic, extinguishing the lantern. Emma froze, her heart racing as the room plunged into darkness. She fumbled with the lantern, trying to relight it, but her matches refused to catch. The air smelled faintly of smoke, bitter, acrid, as if something long buried was burning anew. Then, the sound began. At first, it was faint, a soft, rhythmic creak like footsteps on the floor below. Emma held her breath, straining to hear. The creaking grew louder, deliberate, as if someone or something was climbing the stairs. She clutched the journal tightly, its brittle pages crinkling under her grip. "Hello," she called out, her voice trembling. There was no answer, only the relentless approach of the footsteps. Emma scrambled to her feet, her back pressed against the cold attic wall. The shadows seemed to move now, growing thicker and darker, coalescing in the corners of the room. The footsteps stopped just outside the attic door, and for a moment, all was silent. Then came the sound of a slow, deliberate knock. 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 The door creaked open, revealing nothing but the yawning blackness of the staircase beyond. Emma's chest tightened, her breath shallow as she stared into the void. Her eyes darted back to the journal in her hands. She turned the pages faster now, scanning for anything that could explain what was happening. December 1833. They whisper to me at night. I hear their voices, even when I sleep. They curse my name, but they cannot escape me. None of them can. The pages began to feel warm in her hands, almost too hot to hold. She dropped the journal with a gasp, watching in horror as the ink on the pages bled and shifted, forming new words before her very eyes. You shouldn't have come here. The shadows in the room began to move again, this time surging toward her like an encroaching tide. Emma stumbled backward, her foot catching on a loose floorboard. She fell, landing hard, the breath knocked from her lungs. As she tried to get up, the attic filled with a low, guttural growl. It reverberated through the floor, rattling the beams above her. The journal slid across the floor as if pushed by an unseen hand, stopping at her feet. The attic door slammed shut with a deafening bang, plunging the room into utter blackness. Emma clawed at the walls, desperate for a way out, but the growling grew louder, more guttural, until it was joined by a chorus of agonized screams. She felt it then, a cold, bony hand brushing against her shoulder. She froze, every muscle in her body locking in place. The hand lingered for a moment before it gripped her tightly, pulling her back into the darkness. Emma screamed, thrashing wildly, but the grip was unyielding. Her flashlight flickered to life, illuminating the attic for a brief, horrifying second. In the light, she saw them twisted, mutilated figures with hollow eyes and skeletal faces, their mouths agape in silent torment. They surrounded her, their arms reaching, their faces frozen in an expression of endless suffering. The light flickered off again, and the darkness consumed her. Her screams echoed through the mansion before fading into silence. The next morning, the tour guide arrived to open the mansion for visitors. The house was eerily quiet, more so than usual. As he made his rounds, he noticed something odd, a journal lying on the grand staircase. He picked it up, flipping through its pages, but they were blank. Every single page was empty, as if the words had never existed. He glanced up toward the attic, a chill running down his spine. In the window above, he saw a figure staring back at him, a pale, lifeless woman with wide, terrified eyes. She vanished in the blink of an eye, leaving him to wonder, had it been a trick of the light? Or had the mansion claimed yet another soul? And as he stepped back outside, the door swung shut behind him with an ominous creak, sealing the darkness and its secrets within once more.